There is a language in the heart of Europe that does not belong there. Surrounded on every side by Slavic tongues, Germanic tongues, Latin-rooted tongues, one nation speaks something else entirely, a language related not to its neighbors, but to peoples living thousands of kilometers away, near the Ural Mountains, in the forests of western Siberia. For over 1,000 years, that single fact has anchored the story Hungarians tell about themselves. Horsemen from the East, a tribal alliance that thundered across the steppe and into the Carpathian Basin. A bloodline as distinct as the language that survived the journey. Millions of Hungarian surnames still carry the residue of that story, names built from old tribal words, from warrior titles, from the vocabulary of riders and archers and open grassland. Names like Balo, Sabo, Toth, Nagy, Varga, Kovacs, Horvath, Kiss, Molnar, Farkas, Pap, Takis, Juhas, Lakados, and Fekete are not just family names. They are fragments of a founding myth, the idea that beneath every one of them sits an unbroken line running back to the conquest, to the 7 tribes, to a genetic core that never fully dissolved. Then researchers opened the graves. What they found inside the genome did not simply confirm the legend. It complicated it in ways almost no one expected, and what emerged instead is a story stranger, older, and more human than the one written in the history books. For centuries, the accepted account was elegant in its simplicity. Around the end of the 9th century, an alliance of tribes, the Magyars, joined by Kabur vassals who had broken away from the Khazar state, crossed the Eastern European steppe and entered the Carpathian Basin. Historical chronicles describe 7 tribes under a single leadership, arriving as a unified people with a shared language, a shared homeland, and a shared ancestry stretching back toward the Ural region. Linguists confirm the Eastern signature independently. Hungarian belongs to the Uralic family, a linguistic island in a Slavic and Germanic sea. Everything fit. A people, a language, a migration, a bloodline, one continuous thread. It is the kind of origin story every nation wants. Heroic. Traceable. But even before genetics entered the room, there were small inconsistencies that historians had learned to live with rather than resolve. The material culture of the conquest period graves, the weapons, the belt ornaments, the burial customs, showed remarkable uniformity across the different tribes, so much so that archaeologists could not reliably tell one tribe's graves apart from another's using artifacts alone. If the tribes had come from truly distinct and distant homelands, why did their material world look so similar? And if the population had truly arrived as one unified ethnic bloc, why did later medieval sources describe the Hungarians as an alliance of culturally and linguistically diverse groups rather than a single people? Something did not sit quite right. Not wrong, exactly, just incomplete. Then came the science that could finally look past the artifacts and the chronicles, into the biological archive itself. Ancient DNA analysis works by extracting genetic material directly from human remains, in this case, primarily from teeth and the dense petrous bone of the inner ear, where DNA tends to survive best. From conquest period skeletons, researchers have reconstructed 2 very different kinds of evidence. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the maternal line, offers a record of where the women in a population's ancestry came from. Y chromosome DNA, passed only from father to son, offers the corresponding paternal record. Read together, the 2 systems can reveal something artifacts never could, not just what a population looked like on the surface, but how its lineages were actually assembled, generation by generation, mother by mother, father by father. Researchers studying the elite burials of the Hungarian conquest period applied exactly this approach. And what the DNA returned was not a single, unified signal. It was several. If stories like this interest you, where the evidence doesn't just confirm history but rewrites its texture, this is exactly the kind of investigation this channel exists for. Subscribing helps more of these stories reach you. The maternal lineages, drawn from mitochondrial DNA, pointed toward a mixture of ancestries. A portion traced back toward Central and Inner Asia, toward populations connected, at least in part, to the Asian Scythians and to the Huns who had swept through the region centuries earlier. But the majority of the maternal signal pointed somewhere else, toward Bronze Age populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the wide grassland corridors stretching from the Black Sea toward Central Asia. The closest genetic relatives of the conquest period population, according to this data, were not distant Uralic-speaking hunters near the Urals. They were the Onogur-Bulgar ancestors of the modern Volga Tatars, a Turkic-speaking steppe people. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. And the paternal lineages made the picture even more layered. When researchers sequenced Y chromosome haplogroups from male conqueror period elite burials, they did not find one consistent Eastern signature running through the whole population. They found 7 different haplogroups scattered across just 19 analyzed individuals: C2, G2A, I2, J1, N3A, R1A, and R1B, a spread wide enough to suggest that the conquering population was not one bloodline traveling together, but several distinct paternal ancestries fused into a single political and military alliance. Some of those lineages trace toward East Asia. Others trace toward populations already living in Europe. The genome, in other words, was not describing a tribe. It was describing a coalition. And here the story does something the old narrative never accounted for. The one haplogroup most directly tied to Uralic-speaking populations, the lineage geneticists call N3, sometimes referred to by its defining marker tat, appeared in a striking proportion of the conquest period elite, found in roughly a third to over a third of the sampled individuals. This is, on the surface, exactly what the traditional story would predict: a Uralic-linked paternal signal at the founding moment of the Hungarian nation. But researchers testing modern Hungarian populations for that same marker found something almost paradoxical. In today's Hungarian population, that Uralic-linked N lineage is rare. Not dominant. Not central. Barely present at all. Far rarer, in fact, than among other modern Finno-Ugric-speaking peoples whose languages are also part of the Uralic family. The genetic thread that seemed, for a moment, to validate the founding legend appears to have thinned dramatically over the following 11 centuries. The language survived. The bulk of that specific paternal lineage did not. This is where the story stops being simple and starts becoming genuinely investigative. At least 3 explanatory frameworks now sit on the table, and none of them can be dismissed outright. The first possibility is straightforward demographic dilution. The conquest period population was small relative to the Slavic, Avar, and other communities already living in the Carpathian Basin when the Magyars arrived. Over many centuries of intermarriage, the numerically dominant local populations could have gradually diluted the founding paternal lineages, even while the incoming elite's language became the region's dominant tongue. Language spread and genetic dominance, in this reading, are simply 2 different processes that do not have to move together. The second possibility involves the internal structure of the conquest alliance itself. If the founding population was never a single bloodline but a coalition of tribes from genuinely different regions, Baikal and Altai in the east, the southern Urals in the north, and the Black Sea and northern Caucasus in the south, as some researchers have proposed based on comparing the Y chromosome data to broader Eurasian ancient DNA panels, then the Hungarian identity was multi-ethnic from its very first generation. There was no single ancestral bloodline to dilute. There were several, stitched together by military and political necessity, with language functioning as the unifying institution rather than shared descent. The third possibility is founder effect volatility. Small elite populations, especially ones concentrated in ruling and warrior classes, are statistically vulnerable to random lineage loss over time, a process where certain paternal lines simply fail to produce surviving male descendants across enough generations, regardless of any social or demographic pressure. In a population this size, a rare founding lineage could shrink toward near invisibility purely through the ordinary mathematics of inheritance, with no dramatic historical cause required at all. Researchers remain cautious about choosing definitively among these explanations, and the honest answer is that they likely work together rather than separately: dilution, coalition structure, and founder effects layered on top of one another across 11 centuries of Carpathian Basin history. What makes this more than an academic footnote is the scale of the more recent evidence. Newer studies have expanded well beyond a handful of graves, incorporating dozens of conquest period individuals compared against a much broader panel of ancient and modern Eurasian genomes, Siberian populations, Volga-Ural populations, Caucasus populations, steppe populations spanning 2,000 years. This wider lens is what allowed researchers to move past guessing at a single point of origin and instead map the conquerors as a genuinely composite population, assembled from at least 3 distinct Eurasian source regions rather than one homeland. And this is the twist the surname legend never saw coming. The old story imagined a bloodline, one people, one homeland, one line of descent flowing unbroken from the Ural forests into the Carpathian Basin, preserved today in every surname built from old tribal or warrior vocabulary. The DNA does not erase that story, but it reveals something underneath it that the legend was never built to hold. The conquerors were not a bloodline. They were an alliance, Asian and European, Turkic and Uralic, steppe and forest, fused together under a shared political project and, most durably of all, under a shared language. The language conquered the Carpathian Basin and never let go. The bloodline, in the narrow genetic sense the old story imagined, was always more of a river delta than a single river, many separate channels, briefly running side by side, before the surrounding landscape absorbed most of them back into itself. This is not unique to Hungary. It is, increasingly, what ancient DNA is revealing about founding populations almost everywhere it looks. Nations are not pure genetic streams preserved intact across centuries. They are political and cultural institutions, languages, laws, shared stories, that often survive long after the specific biological lineages that first carried them have thinned, mixed, or dispersed into the wider population around them. Identity, it turns out, is something a people can hold on to with far more permanence than genes ever will. Picture, for a moment, the landscape those conquerors actually rode into. Not a battlefield first, but a basin, the Carpathian ring of mountains curving around a wide fertile plain, rivers threading through grassland that must have looked, to riders raised on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, almost like home. The Danube cutting south. The Tisza winding through open country built for horses and cattle. Villages of Avar and Slavic farmers already rooted in that soil, their own histories already centuries deep before a single Magyar horse crossed the passes. Into that landscape came not one people but several, carrying different mother tongues within their own ranks, different burial customs half-remembered from different homelands, unified mostly by leadership, alliance, and the language that would, against every genetic odd, outlast almost everything else about them. If you carry one of those old Hungarian surnames today, Nagy, Kovacs, Toth, Ballo, Varga, or any of the dozens like them rooted in trade, geography, and old tribal memory, the honest scientific answer is not that your Y chromosome traces in an unbroken line back to a single 9th century warrior. For the vast majority of Hungarians today, the data suggests something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable, that you are the genetic inheritor of everyone who was already living in that basin before the conquest, blended gradually with the fragments of an extraordinary, short-lived, multi-ethnic alliance that arrived speaking a language from a different world entirely and made it stick. The surname survived. The story survived. The language, astonishingly, survived. What the genome shows is that survival and purity were never the same thing, and they never had to be. That is, in the end, the deeper discovery hiding underneath every one of these headlines about ancestry and bloodlines and lost tribes. The old maps we drew of human history, clean lines from one homeland to one people to one modern nation, were never wrong so much as they were too small. The genome does not diminish the Hungarian story by complicating it. It enlarges it, revealing a founding moment built not from a single unbroken bloodline, but from an alliance of strangers who became, through language and shared history, a single people anyway. If you want more stories like this, where the science does not destroy the myth, but reveals the far stranger truth sitting quietly underneath it, let me know in the comments which population's hidden ancestry I should uncover next. The map is still incomplete. It always will be. But every grave that gets tested adds one more line to it, and each one seems to say the same thing. We were never as simple as the story we told about ourselves.